In this video, I'm going to show you how I made this hat just with a regular sewing machine. I've made the pattern available for free at this here URL. It comes with a 1/2 inch seam allowance added in. We're going to do the top bowl part first, or as it's officially known, the crown. My name is Cornelius Quiring. That's my logo. Let's get to making a hat. I'm going to start by doing the bowl or crown of the hat first. This is the side panel and it's slightly lopsided. So I'm going to do one this way and then the other one mirroring it. Okay. And then I also need 2 copies of the back panel. That's the opening in the back there. Again, mirrored. I'm going to flip this one over so it's mirrored as well. These 2 panels make up the front of the hat, and we just need one of each. And now, let's trim them all out. I've had these shears for 5 years now, and they've served me really well. Every purchase supports the channel, and as a bonus, you can get yours engraved with whatever you want as well. And if you do, it's a separate product on the site, so make sure to add it to the cart. To get this smooth, harder finish on the front, I'm going to use this thick plasticky interfacing. If you want a soft finish all around, of course, you can skip this step. This stuff does have glue on the back of it. Make sure that this is nicely centered. And then press it down. On the wrong side, of course. Repeat with this top panel. Next, we need to finish the raw edges, and you decide which method you want to do. I'm going to fold over the edge just about half the seam allowance. Press that down to sit nice and flat. I've done this all the way around the outside on the top piece, and then both sides and the top on this bottom piece. And then I'm going to sew that down so it sits nice and flat. Notice how I'm using a zipper foot to get nice and close to the edge. There we go. Now with right sides touching each other, I align the 2 pieces along this curved edge, and then I'm going to sew from one side to the other. Now I can pull these 2 flaps open and press this seam in the middle here to lie nice and flat. And that's where something like a tailor's ham really comes in handy. I do have a whole tutorial on making one, editing one. You know the drill. And then I flip it all the way so that it's inwards in its final position. I'm going to press it one more time. And finally, I'm going to run 2 stitches, one on each side of this seam, in order to hold the inside seam allowance in place. Voila, that's the front panel. Now we're going to attach this right-hand panel onto this side here. And the way you know which side goes on which is you want the greater slope on the outsides and the narrower slope on the inside closer to the front. If you need to test which is which, you can just lay them on top of each other and you'll see the difference. Because essentially what that does is it helps us give this sort of arch shape in the back of the hat and then more of a squared out roundness in the front. With this panel on both sides again, finish the raw edges, fold it in, stitch them down. There we go. With right sides facing each other, I'm going to align the edges and sew it on along that side. Now I want to press this seam open again all the way along to lie nice and flat. And then I'm going to run a double stitch on either side again, just like I did here. And there we go. It's starting to take shape. On the inside, we can now put this piece aside. We're going to connect the 3 remaining panels next. I'm going to finish the raw edges again. I'm going to do both sides of this side panel. And then for the 2 back pieces, I'm going to finish the raw edges on the outsides along this top curve here. And I will ignore this bottom curve for now, because we're going to do that at the end. There we go. Now let's take these 2 back panels and have right sides facing each other and run the stitch in the back here. There we go. And then just to make sure I sew the final panel in the right place, I like to take the front of the hat, line up these 2 here, which means this one is going to go on this side here. So once again, right sides touching each other like that, and then I'm going to run a stitch from the bottom up to the top. And then let's press these seams open and do the double stitches on each side again. The top here where everything joins on the inside, you're just going to want to push things over so that it all lies as flat as possible. Folded this one back in on itself. That's the inside. That's the outside. From here I'm going to take this back piece, flip it on top of that front piece, and then we can sew all the way along to connect that. Let's press this seam to lie flat as well now. It gets a bit bulky with all the overlapping, so I snipped away all the excess and then I'll cover it up later. And then do the double stitch all the way around. Also, learn from my mistake and make sure to line up the center points so it's not off center. And then, to finish it off, let's deal with this hole in the back here. I'm going to fold it inwards somewhere between 1/8 of an inch to 1/4 inch max. Just get that pressed down. Ooh. Tweezers are a good tool to use. I should know this by now. Like so. Using a really thin, lightweight fabric, trim out the panel, as has been neatly labeled by Editing Corn here. And I'm going to fold it into thirds and press that down. Going to fold over the other side as well. There we go, like that. with the raw edge side facing down. I'm going to align it with the outside edge all the way around. And then I'm going to run two seams, one all the way on the outside and then another one on the inside. No more raw edge, and then matches the double stitching on the outside. All right, let's move on to making the brim. For the bill, I've pulled this out of an old hat. You can also buy these as blanks, or you could probably cut up some plastic items if you're okay with it not getting wet, maybe cardboard, just something that has a little bit of thickness to it and some flexibility and the ability to sew through. The bills and hats today are a plasticky material, but it does have a little bit of a sponginess to it, which allows for the bending and keeping of the shape. If you do want to make your own bill, I have included a pattern piece in the files that you downloaded. Because no two bills are going to be the same size, we're going to create a custom pattern piece. So I'm lying this piece here flat and I'm going to trace it out. We're going to need this fabric to really stretch to fit around here, so that way it lies nice and flat. So I'm only going to add 3/8 of an inch of seam allowance, and I'm actually going to sew in about 1/8 of an inch from the outside. So I'm going to measure around the outside 3/8 of an inch. At the top here, I'm going to add a little bit more seam allowance just so I have extra to play with, and then I can trim it down after. So here I'm going to add about 5/8 of an inch of seam allowance. And then I'm going to draw that in, trim that out, and that is the top pattern piece now. I'm going to trace a copy for the bottom, but along this curve here, I'm going to bring it in about 1/8 of an inch. And we're doing this for two reasons. First, because the bill is curved down like this, we need less fabric for this surface than we do for this surface. But also we want the seam between the top and bottom to land just underneath on the inside edge there. Trim this one out as well. In hindsight, I would recommend using a lighter fabric underneath. It's just going to help that seam sit a little flatter and nicer. With right sides facing each other, I'm going to go ahead and sew this seam around the curve here. And you'll notice I'm sort of tugging on the smaller layer that I have on top here to stretch it out while I'm sewing to fit. I'm going to flip this inside out and then stuff the bill inside to make sure I got the sizing right. And the aim here is to make sure that it fits nice and snug and sits evenly. And in my case, you see how it's nice and tight here, but it's a little bit loose here and then tight again on the sides. Essentially that means that I'm just going to bring out the stitching of my corners just ever so slightly so that I can push the bill forward a touch. So I'm just going to fiddle around with that seam until I get a nice snug fit all the way around. On this bottom layer here, I'm going to trim away as much of the seam allowance as I can without getting too close to that seam. I'm going to do it just on that layer first. There we go. I'm going to repeat on the top layer, but I'm going to go just a little bit further out than I did with that bottom layer. And then on the curves of the top piece, I've also snipped little notches, which should help it to sit flatter in the end. I also want to press open all of these seams to sit nice and flat. I also flip it right way around and give that a pressing as well. Now I'm going to stuff the bill inside and get it in its final position. And I find the key is to get my fingers in here and make sure that all the seam allowance falls on the underneath side. Otherwise, it's going to bubble up and get weird around the outside here. So it's going to be quite a bit of fiddling and using maybe like a seam ripper, for example, to flick it to make sure it lands underneath. I also like to use pins just to hold it all in place while I'm working on it. And then as I get to sewing it, I'm once again using the zipper foot so that I can get as close to the edge as possible. And then I'm using my right hand and I'm essentially pulling as much as I can just to stretch the fabric to really sit as tight as possible. And I'm using all the grip strength that I have. I'm absolutely just muscling it to sit flat and smooth and straight. I also started in the middle, as you can see here. I'm going to work my way around, and I want to get as close to the edge as I can without actually sewing the bill on the inside. Then I flip it over, starting in the middle again, and I'm going to work my way in the opposite direction. As you can see, I did a few rounds here just to get it a little extra snug, so feel free to just keep working it until you get it how you want. I've marked out these lines that I'm going to now stitch the fabric onto the bill. And it never fails to amaze me how decently well I can sew through this thick stuff with a regular needle. That's the bill, ready to go. I'm going to find the center and mark that off. Inside of the crown, I'm also going to find the center and mark that off. I am now going to line up those two spots. Pin that into place. I once again start in the middle, and I'm just going to work my way around. And I find it's a case of constantly readjusting, especially getting out to the edges here. That's where I find the most resistance is. You're really going to have to muscle at this stage to get it to sit as you want it to. There we go. Starting to look like a hat. All right, let's move on to the sweatband. Next, I trimmed out the sweatband, and let's just pretend like I had enough fabric and didn't have to patch mine together. Mine's just going to be straight fabric. Professionally made hats often have a bit of sponge inside of the sweatband. In fact, you can even buy pre-made sweatbands if you want that have sponge in it. I'm now going to zigzag along the long side on both pieces. And then I'm going to repeat around the bottom edge of the hat too. This is just to protect against fraying and things like that. On one side of the sweatband, I'm going to mark off my seam allowance and then fold that up and press it to lay flat. And then just run a seam along to have that lay flat. There we go. Now with right sides touching each other and the side that I didn't fold over and sew, I'm going to align with the bottom of the hat. I'm going to leave a little bit extra hanging over and just align it and pin it all the way around. And then I sew it on. And as I approach the bill, it is once again a case of just muscling it. And I'm sort of feeling with my finger for the ridge of the bill, just so I know where I'm supposed to be sewing. Adjusting and tugging and pulling and continuing along. Let's snip off any excess, so there's only about a 1/2 inch left. I'm going to press that into line nice and flat. To finish it off, I'm going to run a top stitch real close to the edge, all the way around and to the other side, in order to keep that sweatband sitting nice and flat on the inside. And once I get to the bill section here, I'm going to tug on the sweatband with my other hand as much as I can, just to make sure it sits as flat as possible. For the enclosure in the back, I'm once again using the hardware that I pulled out of the used hat. Again, you can buy these snaps if you want to. Alternatively, you can make your own strap, maybe put on some Velcro, and voila, the choice is yours. I just fold over the extra from the sweatband, like so. Stuff it in there. I take the snap bit, put it in, and then I'm just going to run a stitch from top to bottom of the sweatband. That's the inside. On the outside, all those extra seams I ended up putting in there became exposed in this step, so I would recommend taking them out earlier. It was a bit of a pain doing it all in the end here. Now let's deal with this cut up bit in the middle here. I cut out this little piece of lining fabric that does have some interfacing on the back. I pressed in the edges and then just hand stitching that into place to cover up. There we go, that's covered up. To deal with that messiness on top, we can simply stitch on a button. But I'm going to take it one step further and put on a decorative one to make it look intentional. And there we go. That's the hat made. Time to drink in the final product. Thank you to those of you who support me with YouTube memberships. Thank you to the Patreon supporters as well. And an extra shout out to these top tier supporters: